A couple years ago, I was in Kansas City, and it was my first debate against Bart Ehrman. How many of you have heard of Bart Ehrman? Wow, a lot of you. Bart Ehrman, for those of you who haven't heard of him, is probably the most influential, skeptical New Testament scholar in North America. He teaches at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So I'm getting ready to debate him, and he and I are having dinner together beforehand with a few others. And one of the people we were having dinner with is the present offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. He used to be the head coach for Georgia Tech. I forgot his name, but it was a really, really interesting dinner, and I was asking him all these questions, and I said, hey, tell me, these guys that play football their whole careers, they have this whole career in the NFL, what are they like afterward? Are they in pain? He said, for the rest of their lives, they will be in pain. Everyone except maybe the kicker. And I got thinking about that, you know, all the blows that they take, and you've got, even with all that equipment, you've got, you know, everything from head to toe, all this very expensive equipment you're wearing, and you wouldn't want to go without any of it. Like the shoulder pads. Imagine playing organized football without shoulder pads. You know, all it could take is just one hit, put you out for the game, the season, maybe your career. It could really hurt you. But of all the pieces of equipment that you would wear in organized football, the most important piece of equipment, of course, is the helmet. Now, this is an authentic Baltimore Ravens helmet. They run about $200, whatever team you get. I got a Ravens helmet because I'm from Baltimore. Had I been from Dallas, this would be a Cowboy helmet because the Cowboys are a cool team. You know, if you live in Dallas and if you like high school football. But but so this is they're going to pay $200 for something like this, just like the pros wear on the field. And you've got all this kind of padding inside, and the helmet's made out of a special, very durable plastic of some sort. And you're not going to cut costs on something like this because of everything that you wear on a football field. This is the most important. You take a good head blow, that could mean your life. So it's important that you do your best to protect your head on this. Well, that's when we talk about the physical realm. But what about when we talk about the intellectual and the spiritual realm? It seems that when we go off to college, we're liable to take a lot of head blows, aren't we? First day of class, you walk in. I've been told this. I've spoken on over 50 campuses. I've been told by numerous students on other campuses that the first day of class, the teacher said, the professor says, how many of you are Christians in this class? A few will raise their hand and say, my objective is by the end of this semester, you will no longer be a Christian. That happened at University of Georgia, near a couple hours from where I live. It's happened up at the University of Massachusetts. Like a month and a half ago, they told me at New Mexico State University, it's happening there. I've had it happen all over the country, students tell me. It's happening there. Now think about this for a moment. Imagine if on the first day of class that professor said, how many of you are Muslims? How many of you are Jews? How many of you are Hindus? That would never happen, would it? But it's open season on Christians. In 2007, there was a report that came out by two Jewish researchers. It's posted on the web. They interviewed over 1,300 American faculty from just under 700 American universities. And they wanted to find out what were the religious sentiments of American faculty toward religious followers. What they found is that there were 3% of the professors in the United States have negative or unfavorable feelings toward Jews. 22%, however, had negative and unfavorable feelings toward Muslims. The percentage that had negative and unfavorable feeling toward evangelical Christians, 53%. These two Jewish researchers went on to report that the majority of American faculty wanted it, so they desired that Muslims would play a greater role in American politics, but they didn't want evangelical Christians to have any whatsoever. any part in the American political process. They went on to say, this is very concerning to us. We don't understand why this is happening. They said, we can see where American students, Christian students, are definitely, most certainly, being discriminated against because of their faith, as are Christian professors. They're getting denied tenure. They're not getting a fair shake when it comes to getting posts, teaching posts at the various schools. So what do we do about this? They said, we don't know. They said, one thing is for certain, though, the concern of Christian parents about sending their kids to secular universities for fear that they will be discriminated against is well-founded. There's a lot of head blows that's happening. And a lot of those head blows are directed toward the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bart Ehrman, I've had the opportunity to debate him twice, and nice guy, I like him. In fact, I would consider him a friend. He just has lousy arguments. And, as in our debates, he goes and he attacks the Gospels, which was pretty irrelevant to our debate on debates on the resurrection. But nevertheless, a lot of Christians wanted responses to these. They wanted to know some of the answers to these objections that Ehrman's given. So, are the Gospels trustworthy? I'm going to come in from the back door, and I'm going to do that by answering some of the major objections that are given by scholars today against the historical reliability of the Gospels. I'm going to cite Ehrman most of all because he has popularized these objections, and he's one of the main people out there giving these objections. But these apply, if you're out there sharing your faith at all and they're objecting to the Gospels, I am certain you've heard these. So let's talk about these. We're calling them the ABCs, Ds, and Es of defending the Gospels. Let's look at the A's, authorship. Now, Ehrman goes on to say, he says, the Gospels are forgeries. He says, what I mean by that is they claim to be authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but nobody believes in the academic community that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually penned these. He goes on to say that when you look at the manuscripts, the original manuscripts of these Gospels did not contain the titles that we see on them today. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. So what do we say about this? Well, first I would say that we really don't know if the originals had the titles because we don't have the originals. And we haven't had them for some time. So Ehrman really can't say that these titles weren't in the originals at some point because he's never seen them. But what if the Gospels in the autographs, the originals, what if they didn't contain the titles? What if they were anonymous, which is Ehrman's complaint? Well, it's really no big deal. Plutarch is the most prolific biographer in antiquity. He wrote probably 60 biographies. We really don't know how many exactly, but he wrote about 60, and we still have about 4 dozen of those that remain. So 48 is pretty good for the total number of biographies written on ancient figures. He's writing just after the turn of the 2nd century, so within a couple of decades of when the Gospels were written. You can purchase these. You can probably go online and see them. I've got my copies through the Harvard Loeb Classical Library series. You can read the Greek that was used on one side, the English on the other. And there's 10 volumes to fit in these 48 biographies. I did a search, and would you like to know how many times Plutarch's name appears in the 48 biographies we still have? It never does. Well, how do we know Plutarch wrote it then? Well, because the tradition had been passed along by ancient writers who knew who wrote these. For example, someone might quote Plutarch's, one of his biographies, and say, as Plutarch wrote in his life of Theseus, the legendary founder of Greece. So they'll quote Plutarch, or they will attribute these biographies to him. Well, is it possible that all of these people were mistaken and that Plutarch didn't write them? Sure, anything's possible. But historians don't look for possibilities, they look for probabilities. And when you have the unanimous testimony that Plutarch wrote these, well, historians just don't really question it at that point any longer, and we accept that Plutarch wrote those. Well, if that works for secular authors, why wouldn't it work for Christian authors? So then what traditions, you might say? Let's just assume for a moment that Ehrman is right and that none of the Gospels bear the titles on it that we have in our New Testaments today. Well, there are traditions that have been passed along from early Christians, the early church fathers, that attribute the Gospels to the traditional authorship that we see in our New Testaments. The first one to do this is a guy named Papias. We really don't know when Papias wrote, kind of like the latest dates around 120. Many scholars are now putting him in the first decade of the 2nd century, so we could say, like around 105 to 110. But I'm just going to take, to be cautious, I'm going to take the later date, because the earlier the better. So let's just say the later. And Papias is the first one to report who wrote the Gospels. Papias says that John, or the beloved disciple, wrote, actually says John did, wrote the Gospel attributed to him. And we put that around the year 90. Now Papias wrote about somewhere between 15 and 30 years after that, because if John is writing around 90 and Papias is writing somewhere between 105 to 120, that's 15 to 30 years after John penned it. All right, and Papias is pretty close to John because Papias got his information from a guy named the Elder John, who is called the Elder John to distinguish him from the Apostle John, and the Elder John got his information from the Apostles. So this is only 2 removed and 15 to 30 years removed from when John wrote his Gospel. Now Papias tells us that Matthew, the tax collector, and one of Jesus' disciples wrote Matthew. Mark, he says, was not an eyewitness, but he got his information directly from the Apostle Peter. So he's writing from the memoirs of Peter. And most scholars today grant that as well. They believe, more than half of the scholars, including skeptical ones who write on this topic, say that Mark got his information from Peter. Even Elaine Pagels at Princeton says this. She acknowledges it. The big question is, did he pen the Gospel of Mark while Peter was alive, or did he do it shortly after Peter died? That's really the only question that most scholars are still in heavy debate over when it comes to Mark. And then Papias, like I said a moment ago, says that John wrote, who was the beloved disciple, wrote John's Gospel. Now I didn't mention Luke because Papias doesn't mention him. The authorship of Luke's Gospel comes just a little bit later through a guy named Justin, who writes around the year 150. He's also known as Justin Martyr because he was later martyred for his faith. And he mentions how Luke was the physician by trade, and that he was a traveling companion of Paul, and that he got his information from the eyewitnesses. And if you turn to Luke's Gospel, the first 4 verses tell us that, pretty much that Luke got his information from those who saw the Lord and who got the message from the Lord. So these are the first 2 guys who, in antiquity, who report, give us reports concerning the authorship of the Gospels. That's where it comes from. And then we have several other Christians who mention it afterward. And so that's where the traditional authorship of the Gospels come from. Now, is it possible that these guys, all these ancient authors, Papias, Justin, and all the others who mention the authorship, is it possible that they're mistaken? Sure, anything's possible. But again, historians must go by probable, not just possible. And the unanimous testimony, it's unanimous, that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. So unless you can come up with some really, really strong arguments to the contrary, the traditional authorship is something that we should give serious consideration to. James D.G. Dunn, not necessarily an evangelical, but one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the world, just last year in his large volume on the book of Acts and history, he writes, "To be sure, 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels have traditionally been attributed to 2 of the 12, Matthew and John, and the claim deserves respect." Now this is a guy who probably doesn't believe in the traditional authorship of the Gospels. And Matthew and John, he mentions those because those 2 are the most hotly disputed. The truth of the matter is, from those who have specialized in this, the majority of scholars, as I said a moment ago, believe that Mark wrote Mark and Luke wrote Luke. More than 50% of them do. The two that are most hotly disputed are Matthew and John. And here's Dunn saying that even when it comes to the traditional authorship of Matthew and John, the claim of the traditional authorship deserves respect. We talked about the ABCs, D's, and E's. Let's look at B's, bias. Ehrman, and you've heard it yourself from many others, and they say, the gospel authors were biased. We shouldn't believe them. I remember my very first debate was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I debated a guy named Dan Barker, who used to be in the ministry, and he left, and he started the Freedom From Religion Foundation, wrote a book called Losing Faith in Faith. And so he's my first opponent, and we're up there, and he says we shouldn't believe the Gospels because they're biased. In fact, the authors were not only biased, they were giving us propaganda. And he cites from the Gospel of John, who says, I have written these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And he says, see, he's writing with this intention. He wants you to believe. So he's got this agenda, and so we should reject it because it's propaganda. So I turned to him and I said, well, Dan, you wrote this book called Losing Faith in Faith. You wrote this book so that we may not believe. You have an agenda behind it, so it's propaganda. Should we throw it out? So there's some inconsistencies in the thinking. Let's look at some other books here. Or before we go to some other books, let's consider this. You watched the Super Bowl 2 years ago, and one of the very last plays of the game, I mean, the score is switching. It's going back and forth, back and forth. It's a tense game. Anyone could win it. Pittsburgh just scores with about 2 minutes left to play. So now Phoenix is coming down the field. Kurt Warner, great quarterback, going back to pass. There's like 17 seconds left. The best receiver in the NFL at that point is bolting down the field. Warner's going back to throw it to him, and this Pittsburgh Steeler comes out of nowhere, and the ball comes loose. Pittsburgh falls on it, and the Steelers win the Super Bowl. Now, it was very close, and in the NFL, there's this rule that if the hand was just slightly going forward when that ball comes out, it's an incomplete pass. But if the hand was stationary, it's a fumble. So you're watching the replays, and you're wondering what happened here. Was this a fumble, or was it an incomplete pass? The way you decided on it was largely dependent on whether you were pulling for Pittsburgh or Phoenix. Right? Bias impacts us all. It's not only in religious matters, it's also in sports, it's in politics, it's anything that has to do with our race, our gender, our ethics, our nationality, our philosophical, political, religious, moral, ethical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. Everybody's impacted by this. And there's a consensus amongst professional historians who acknowledge this. So it's kind of like when Ehrman says, well, the gospel authors were biased. You know, all of us who have studied philosophy of history and historical method just kind of look at him and go, duh, who's not? We're all biased. Every last one of us in this room are biased. It's just that, so the issue isn't bias. The issue is our arguments. Do we have good arguments to support our view? Gerrit Ludemann is an atheist New Testament scholar, and in his book, The Resurrection of Christ in 2004, he writes, the aim of this book was to prove the non-historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and simultaneously to encourage Christians to change their faith accordingly. Was Ludemann biased? Did he have an agenda? Should we throw out his book because he had an agenda? No, come on, guys. You throw it out because the content stinks, not because he's biased. Richard Dawkins, another militant atheist, a guy that's been weaned on a pickle. And in his book, The God Delusion, Dawkins writes, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Is Dawkins biased? Does he have an agenda? Is this propaganda? You bet. Does that mean he's wrong? Yes. No. His arguments are wrong, but just because he's biased doesn't mean he's wrong. Again, you can be biased but right. What about historians, Jewish historians, as Craig Blomberg points out? What about Jewish historians who write on the Holocaust? Are they biased? You think there's a bit of propaganda in reporting the atrocities at Auschwitz and Dachau? Of course. Doesn't mean it's false, though. Propaganda can be good. Some of you won't remember this commercial. I'm 49, but several years ago, there was this commercial that just had some eggs, and it said, "This is your brain." All right, and then they cracked the eggs and put it in and show them frying and said, "This is your brain on drugs." Was that propaganda? Was there an objective behind that commercial? Of course there was, to keep people from taking, or to discourage them from taking drugs. Was the commercial true? Of course. So just because it's propaganda or has an objective doesn't mean it's wrong.